Hey everyone, Ethanator here with Hangar 9 and welcome to the fourth build video of the Hangar 9 CubCrafters XCub 60cc. Again, this is all part of the Hangar 9 Back to Balsa series, and it's been super fun making these build videos. If you haven't gotten up to this point, be sure to check the previous videos, or if you're past this point, you can look at the videos ahead of this one. But this video is going to be dedicated to the installation of the tail on the XCub 60cc. That's going to cover basically the elevator and rudder installation along with their respective servos. First, we are going to be installing the horizontal stabilizer. In order to do that, we are going to have to remove one of the elevator halves like you see here. So these hinges that are in here are not glued or anything. We are going to have to epoxy them later. So with a little bit of pressure, you can just pull the elevator half right out. You can also remove the hinges here so they don't interfere with the installation process. With the elevator half removed, we can slide the horizontal stab into the tail of the fuselage in its appropriate slot. So then the other half of the elevator doesn't interfere with the next step. You can go ahead and remove it as well. Up next, you are going to want to ensure that the horizontal stab is seated evenly within the fuselage. So in order to do so, I'm going to use a yardstick in order to measure from a point on the wing or the fuselage to a point on the stab. And I'm doing so to ensure that the measurement on the left side is even with the measurement on the right side. If it is off a little bit, you can adjust the horizontal stab as necessary, so then you get equal measurements on both the left and right side of the stab and on the fuselage or wing, basically wherever you plan to measure on the airplane. Keep in mind that this is also a test fit and glue is not being used at this point in time. With the horizontal stab evenly seated within the tail section of the fuselage, we are going to trace around where the tail section meets the horizontal stab with a pin, and this is ultimately to mark where we are going to cut the ultracoat or the covering from the horizontal stab. This is going to be done in order to expose the wood and ultimately provide a better bond for the epoxy when gluing in the horizontal stab to the tail section. Ensure that you have traced both the top and bottom side of both the left and right side of the horizontal stab. Once you have done so, you can remove the horizontal stab from the tail section. With the horizontal stab back on the build table as you see here, acquire a number 2 X-Acto blade. You want to make sure that you have a fresh blade so that it can trim through the covering nice and clean. And basically you are going to want to trim where you traced, or if you want, you can even trim a little bit inside. You typically just want to have a decent amount of wood exposed, but not too much to where it's going to ruin the look of the airplane. If you go outside of the trace marks, then whenever you glue in the horizontal stab, you might see a little bit of exposed wood, and that just doesn't really necessarily look nice on the airplane. So as long as you maintain within the markings that you traced on the horizontal stab, you should be good to go. One thing that you want to ensure is that you put just enough pressure in order to cut through the covering, but not too much pressure so then you don't cut into the wood. If you cut into the wood a little bit, there's nothing wrong with that, but if you cut too hard into it, you could ultimately damage the wood in the horizontal stab. So feel free to take as much time as you need, and again, it might not be one solid peel off with the covering. As you can see here in the video, the covering kind of ripped into certain portions, and again, you just have to take your time with this step, and ultimately you just don't want to go past the markings. As long as you stay within the lines as shown in the video, you are good to go. Once you have successfully peeled off the covering that is necessary, you can go over the horizontal stab once again with a sealing iron. This is ultimately to make sure that the covering where you cut it bonds to the wood. Once again, you don't want it too loose or else in flight it may peel off. Using a paintbrush, you can apply some freshly mixed 30-minute epoxy onto the horizontal stab. As you can see here, there is an even coat. You don't want to cake it on too much, but you also don't want to use too little. A fine even coat like you see in the video will suffice. Once the epoxy is applied, you can reinstall the horizontal stab. While the epoxy is still curing and you can still freely move the horizontal stab, now is a good time to remeasure the points that you had previously measured to make sure that the stab is in evenly. Now is also a good time to get eye level with the horizontal stab and ensure that it is parallel with the wing. Using a paper towel mixed in with some alcohol, you can wipe away any excess epoxy. While the epoxy on the horizontal stab is curing, you can go ahead and test fit the vertical stab and the rudder. Just like you did with the horizontal stab, you are going to want to trace out where the vertical stab meets the tail section of the fuselage. Using the same method as with the horizontal stab, you are going to want to use a fresh number 2 X-Acto blade to peel away the covering where you marked it. At this time, you can also separate the rudder from the vertical stab. Once again, using a paintbrush and some freshly mixed 30-minute epoxy, you can go ahead and apply an even coat of epoxy onto the exposed wood section of the vertical stab. In order to keep the vertical stab aligned and in place on the fuselage, it is a good idea to secure it onto the fuselage with a little bit of painter's tape. Using a paper towel dipped in some alcohol, you can wipe away any excess epoxy that may have seeped out of the slot. Before the epoxy cures on the vertical stab, it's good to ensure that it is 90 degrees perpendicular to the horizontal stab. Using some freshly mixed 30-minute epoxy, we can go ahead and install the hinges onto the elevator side. As you can see here, we are taking a toothpick with a little bit of epoxy, inserting some epoxy into the holes where each hinge goes, and also applying a little bit of epoxy to the hinge itself. We can insert the hinge into the elevator like so. Keep a paper towel dipped in some alcohol nearby so you can rub away any excess epoxy. It is extremely important that you do not get any epoxy within the pivot point of the hinge, because once the epoxy cures, and if there is any in that pivot point, it will seize the hinge up and your surface will not move freely. It is a good idea to use a Q-tip dipped in alcohol to apply some alcohol into the pivot point of the hinge. This will essentially help keep the hinge moving freely. You can now apply some epoxy on the other side of the hinges and also in the hinge holes on the horizontal stab, and you can now install the elevator half. Again, you will want to take a paper towel dipped in some alcohol and rub away any of the excess epoxy. After this is done, you can again take a Q-tip dipped in alcohol and apply some alcohol into the hinge line. You can move the elevator half up and down and ensure that it moves freely. Now is also a good time to ensure that the hinge gap is even throughout the entire elevator half. You can now apply some epoxy on the other side of the hinges and also in the hinge holes on the horizontal stab, and you can now install the elevator half. Before hinging up the rudder, now is a great time to install the taillight. So as you can see here, provided we have a string in order to pull the wire of the taillight through the rudder in order to come out the other side right here. This step can prove to be a bit challenging as the hole is pretty narrow going through the rudder, and you have to be very precise feeding the wire through the rudder. One thing that I did to make it a little bit easier was remove the wire connectors, so then I just pulled through the wires and it essentially went through the rudder a whole lot easier. Once the wires were routed through the rudder, you can go ahead and reinstall the connector. Once the wires are completely routed through the rudder, you can go ahead and use a little bit of CA to secure the tail light onto the rudder. You can now route the tail light wire through the second to last hole from the bottom of the tail section of the fuselage as you see here before installing the rudder. Once this is complete, using the same hinging method as you did with the elevator, you can now install the rudder. Once the epoxy for the elevator and rudder have cured, you can go ahead and flip the fuselage over and remove the bottom radio hatch in order to install the elevator and rudder servos. Up next is the rudder pull cable installation. So go ahead and locate the parts that are shown here. So we have the M3 by 10mm screws along with the M3 washers, the M3 lock nut, the servo arm itself, we have the ball links, and then we also have the cable fittings. Alright, so the first step is to thread on the ball links onto the cable fittings, and you want to thread them about halfway into the portion of the ball link. This is so then you can adjust in the pull cable if you need to. It may be too loose or it may be too tight. You just don't want to fully thread in the ball link and then you're unable to adjust it one way. You essentially want it halfway threaded into the ball link so then you can either tighten the cable or loosen the cable. Up next, we are going to attach the ball links to the double servo arm that you see here. I'm going to be using the 5/8 inch hole on the servo arm. These ball links are going to be installed using the M3 by 10 screw and also the M3 washer as you see here. Once the screw is coming out of the other side of the servo arm, you can go ahead and attach the M3 lock nut and tighten the assembly down. Repeat this assembly process for the other ball link on the other side of the double servo arm. Next, locate this parts bag, which contains the pull cable and also the crimps that are going to be used. The next step is to take the pull cable, route it through one of the crimps, and then through the fitting, and then back through the crimp like so. With this particular pull cable setup, you want to ensure that the crimps are as close to the fitting as possible, making the loop very small as you can see here. Once the crimp is in position on the pull cable, clamp down on the crimp using a pair of pliers. This is to ensure that the pull cable does not get loose. Repeating this process with the other pull cable for the other side of the double servo arm, take both pull cables and route each of them through the two innermost cable sleeves on the fuselage. Both pull cables should come out of the slots located in the tail section of the fuselage as shown in this video. You can trim the excess cable coming out of the crimp as shown here in the video. Feel free to apply a little bit of CA into the crimps to better secure the cable. With the rudder servo centered up, you can install the servo arm. Using another set of cable fittings and ball links, you can install these onto the rudder control arms using an M3x15 socket head cap screw, two M3 washers, and an M3 lock nut. Using the same method as before, install both pull cables through the fittings on the rudder control arm. Next, you can thread a ball link onto the elevator push rod, which is the longest push rod that you're going to see with the airplane. You can now attach the ball link to the elevator servo arm using an M3x12 socket head cap screw, M3 lock nut, and M3 washer as shown in the video. Slide the other side of the elevator push rod through one of the outermost push rod sleeves in the fuselage. With the elevator servo centered, you can install the servo arm onto the servo. While ensuring that the elevator is flush with the horizontal stab, you can attach the ball link to the elevator control arm using an M3x15 socket head cap screw, two M3 washers, and an M3 lock nut. Repeat this entire assembly process with the other elevator push rod. While the XCub is still upside down, now is a good time to install the tail wheel. You can start by first removing the tail wheel bolt and the brass spacers by loosening up the M4 lock nut on the other side. You can now use that same hardware included with the tail wheel to secure the wheel in the fork. The brass spacers are located on either side of the wheel when placed in the fork. Up next, you can place the tiller arm on the bottom of the rudder with the leading edge of the arm aligned with the rudder hinge line. You can mark the locations for the mounting screws on the rudder using a pin. Once you have marked the locations for the mounting screws, you can use a 2mm drill bit to drill the two locations for the tiller arm mounting screws. Once you have drilled the holes, you can take the M3x12 sheet metal screws, apply a little bit of CA to the threads, and screw them into the mounting holes to secure the tiller arm in place. Next, you can remove the nut and the washer from the screws on the tail wheel leaf spring. Locate the stabilizer brace mount from the tail brace hardware bag. Place the stabilizer brace mount into its appropriate location as shown in the video. Secure the tail gear to the fuselage using the tail wheel leaf spring mounting screws. Ensure that you install these screws using Loctite. You can now attach the springs to the tail wheel and rudder tiller arms. It is now time for the tail bracing installation. The first step is to thread an M3 nut on the cable fittings, then place a silicone retainer on the clevis and thread the clevis on the fitting so the end of the fitting is barely visible between the forks of the clevis. Repeat this process 3 more times so then you have 4 fittings in total. Slide a pre-bent aluminum cable tab on an M3x18 machine screw and slide the screw through the hole in the top side of the stabilizer. The threads of that screw will stick out on the bottom of the horizontal stabilizer, and this is where you will slide on another pre-bent tab and secure it with an M3 lock nut. You can repeat this process for the hole on the vertical stab. Using the cable that's found in the tail brace hardware bag, attach the cable to the fittings that you just made using the same method as the pull cable assembly. Do this process 3 more times so that all 4 pieces of cable are attached to a fitting. Starting on the top side of the horizontal stabilizer, you can attach one of the clevises to the tab. Once you have confirmed that the pin of the clevis has been fully engaged into the other tab, you can slide over the fuel tubing to ensure that the clevis does not come loose in flight. Slide the other side of the cable through a crimping sleeve and then through the tab on the vertical stabilizer and then back through the crimping sleeve. Once you have the cable decently tight, you can use a pair of pliers to crimp down the crimping sleeve. You can then cut any excess cable. The tension on these brace cables should be pretty light. Keep in mind that you can tighten or loosen the cable tension through the clevis and the cable fitting right here. Once you are satisfied with the cable tension, you can use some Loctite to secure the M3 nut. You can repeat this process for the other side of the horizontal and vertical stab. You are essentially going to be doing the same thing on the bottom side of the horizontal stab using the remaining 2 tail brace cables. However, for the bottom, the cable is going to be sliding through the stabilizer brace mount. Repeat this same process for the other side. And with that, the tail section on the Hangar 9 XCub 60cc is complete. So as you can see here, we have the horizontal and the vertical stabilizer installed onto the airplane. We also have the elevator and rudder hinged up, as well as the control surfaces all hooked up to their appropriate servos, along with the tail wheel and the tail light. So I would say this is probably the most tedious process of the XCub 60cc build, just because you are working with a lot of epoxy, doing some measuring, doing some hinging, but if you made it this far, it's going to be smooth sailing after this. So stay tuned for the engine installation and mounting process, which is going to be the next video. So we'll see you all in the next build video of the Hangar 9 XCub 60cc, all part of the Hangar 9 Back to Balsa series.